On a freezing Christmas Eve in Portland, while the city glowed with laughter and lights, one broken man carried only his grief through the night. David Miller, a 38-year-old widower, had lost his wife and unborn son 3 years ago. Since then, life had been nothing but silence. But that night, everything changed. Behind his apartment, David saw a fragile little girl digging through trash, her cheeks red from the cold, her hands shaking with hunger. In that single moment, his lonely world collided with hers, and two shattered souls unknowingly began a journey that would change both of their lives forever. David froze, his breath forming white clouds in the air. The girl couldn't have been more than 7. She looked up at him, startled, her wide eyes filled with fear, ready to run. "Hey, it's okay," David said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you." She clutched the piece of stale bread in her hand, silent. Her lips quivered from the cold. "What's your name?" he asked gently. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then in a whisper she answered, "Melody." The name struck him. It sounded so full of life, so opposite to the fragile child standing before him. "You hungry?" he asked. Her silence was answer enough. He took a slow step forward. "I live right here. Just some food. Somewhere warm. You can leave any time you want. I promise." Melody hesitated, torn between fear and desperation. Finally, she nodded faintly. Inside his small apartment, David quickly cleared the couch and turned on the heater. Melody stepped in cautiously, clutching herself tightly. He made her a peanut butter sandwich and hot chocolate, setting it gently on the table. She eyed the food suspiciously at first, then devoured it hungrily, her small hands trembling. David sat across from her, his throat tightening. "How long have you been out there?" he asked quietly. "Couple days," she muttered. "Where's your family?" Her face fell. She didn't answer, staring into the mug. David swallowed hard, his chest heavy. Watching her curl up on the couch with the blanket later that night, fast asleep, something stirred deep inside him. His apartment, silent for so long, suddenly felt alive again. David lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with questions. Who had failed this child? How had she ended up alone on Christmas Eve? In the morning, Melody was still asleep on the couch, clutching the blanket tightly. When she finally stirred awake, her eyes darted around the room as if she feared everything would vanish. "Morning," David said softly. "You like pancakes?" Her eyes widened just slightly, and for the first time, the faintest hint of a smile touched her lips. As he flipped pancakes in the kitchen, Melody sat at the table, watching him intently, her small hands wrapped around the blanket. She was cautious, guarded, but he saw something fragile behind her eyes, hope. And in that moment, David realized something terrifying. If he let her go back into the freezing streets, he would never forgive himself. This wasn't chance. This was his moment to step up, no matter how broken he was. By the time breakfast was ready, he knew one thing. He couldn't let Melody disappear from his life. Not tonight. Not ever. For the first time in years, David woke up with a sense of responsibility that stretched beyond his own grief. The faint sounds of Melody moving around his small apartment drew him out of bed. She was sitting quietly on the couch, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a shield, her little feet barely touching the floor. "Morning," David said, forcing a warm tone into his tired voice. She nodded slightly but didn't answer. Her guarded silence was heavy, the kind of silence that spoke of wounds too deep for words. David knew better than to push. He made scrambled eggs and toast, placing a plate gently in front of her. "Eat what you like. No rush." Melody stared at the food for a long moment before picking up a fork. She ate slowly this time, her eyes flicking up at him now and then, as if trying to decide whether he was safe. After breakfast, David sat down across from her. "Melody," he began carefully, "I need to know if there's someone out there looking for you. Family? A foster home?" Her fork froze in midair. She stared at the plate, her shoulders tensing. "My grandma used to take care of me," she whispered finally. "She got sick. Then she didn't wake up." David's chest tightened. He leaned forward. "What happened after?" "They put me in places," she muttered. "With people I didn't know. Some were nice. Some weren't. Nobody wanted me for long." Her voice cracked, and she shoved another bite into her mouth to cover it. David's heart ached. He remembered the social worker's words when his wife died, "Time heals." But what he saw in Melody was proof that time didn't heal, connection did. "Listen," he said gently. "You don't have to be alone anymore. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. As long as you're here, you're safe." Her eyes lifted for just a second, filled with doubt and fragile hope. It was the smallest flicker, but for David it was enough. Later that afternoon, David made a decision he couldn't ignore. He needed to call child services. He knew it was the law. More importantly, he wanted Melody to get the care she deserved. But when he picked up the phone, his hands shook. What if they took her away to another cold, temporary home? What if she ended up with strangers who didn't see her the way he did? Melody watched him closely, sensing his hesitation. "Are you sending me back?" she asked in a trembling voice. David's throat tightened. He set the phone down slowly. "I'm not sending you anywhere, Melody. I just need to figure out what's best for you. And I promise, whatever happens, I'll be right here." She looked at him with eyes too old for her age. "They always say that," she whispered. "But they never stay." Her words hit him like a knife. David swallowed hard, fighting back the ache in his chest. He thought of Anna, of the promise he couldn't keep to her when she slipped away. This time he vowed he wouldn't fail. That evening, David took Melody out for a walk. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky as they strolled past rows of decorated houses glowing with Christmas cheer. Children's laughter rang out from windows, families gathered around trees. Melody walked silently beside him, her hands buried deep in the two big sleeves of his spare coat. David glanced at her small figure and felt something stir inside him. A quiet but undeniable sense of purpose. For the first time in 3 years, his heart whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had something left to give. When they returned, he tucked Melody into the couch again, pulling the blanket snug around her shoulders. She blinked up at him, exhaustion softening her guarded face. "Good night, Melody," he whispered. Her lips moved faintly. "Good night, David." It was the first time she'd spoken his name, and though her voice was fragile, it carried a weight that broke through every wall he had built around himself. The next morning, David woke earlier than usual. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the sound of Melody shifting in her sleep, or maybe it was the unspoken weight in his chest. He quietly brewed coffee and stared out the frosted window. Snow blanketed the street, children in colorful hats hurried past with sleds, and the faint sound of Christmas carols drifted from a neighbor's house. Behind him, Melody stirred. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, her hair sticking up in uneven tufts. For a brief second, David almost smiled. She looked like any other child waking up in a safe home. "Morning, kiddo," he said softly. She blinked at him, then gave the smallest nod. "Morning." That one word warmed him more than the coffee in his hand. After breakfast, David decided to take her grocery shopping. He knew it wasn't much, but he wanted her to feel normal again, even if only for a little while. Inside the store, Melody clung close to his side, her eyes darting nervously. She flinched when someone brushed past, and David instantly noticed. Without thinking, he rested a protective hand on her shoulder. "You're okay," he murmured. "I'm right here." Gradually, she relaxed enough to look around. When they passed the toy aisle, she slowed, her gaze locking on a small stuffed bunny with floppy ears. She didn't reach for it, just stared, her eyes wide with a longing she tried to hide. David noticed. He didn't say anything then, but he made a mental note. Back at the apartment, Melody helped him put groceries away. She wasn't used to someone thanking her for small things, but when David said, "Thanks, partner," her lips twitched in what might have been the start of a smile. For David, that single almost smile was everything. That evening, David pulled out a small wrapped box he had secretly picked up at the store. He wasn't good at wrapping, tape stuck unevenly, the paper crinkled, but it didn't matter. He placed it on the table in front of Melody. Her eyes widened. "What's this?" "Just a little early Christmas gift," he said, scratching the back of his neck nervously. She hesitated, almost afraid to touch it. Finally, she carefully tore away the paper. When the floppy-eared bunny appeared, her breath caught. She stared at it as though she couldn't believe it was real. "You got this for me?" she whispered. "Yeah," David said softly. "Every kid deserves a friend. Even the tough ones." For the first time, Melody's lips curled into a genuine smile. A small, trembling thing, but real. She hugged the bunny tight to her chest, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were so quiet David barely heard them, but the weight behind them was enormous. He swallowed hard, fighting the lump in his throat. Later that night, when Melody had fallen asleep on the couch with the bunny clutched in her arms, David sat alone in the kitchen. He stared at the phone again, child services number still written on a slip of paper. Every instinct told him calling was the right thing to do. But as he glanced at the sleeping child in the next room, he couldn't shake the feeling that if he let her go, he would lose something far more important than rules and regulations could measure. For the first time in 3 years, David prayed. Not for himself, but for Melody. For the strength to give her the home she deserved. Snow continued to fall in Portland, covering everything in a soft white blanket. Days with Melody had begun to take on a rhythm. She woke up a little earlier now, spoke a few more words, even laughed once when David accidentally spilled flour while trying to bake cookies. Each small moment felt like a victory. For the first time in years, David's apartment wasn't silent, it was alive. But there was one thing David couldn't avoid forever: people noticing. When his neighbor Mrs. Parker, an older woman with kind but sharp eyes, saw Melody holding his hand in the hallway, she tilted her head. "David," she said with gentle curiosity. "Who's this little one?" David hesitated. "This is Melody. She's staying with me for a while." Mrs. Parker's expression softened, but David could see the questions forming. "Well, she's a sweet girl. Just make sure everything's, proper." Her words lingered in David's head long after she left. Proper. He knew what she meant. He wasn't her legal guardian. If anyone reported it, there would be questions, investigations, maybe even worse. That night, as Melody colored quietly on the coffee table, David watched her small hands gripping the crayons. Her bunny sat beside her, its floppy ears smudged with cookie flour. "Hey Mel," he said gently. "Do you like it here?" She froze, the crayon pausing mid-stroke. Then she looked up at him, her eyes wide but unguarded. "It feels safe." David's chest tightened. Safe. That was all she wanted. And somehow, that one word made his decision even harder. The next day, David finally worked up the courage to make the call. He sat at the table with the phone in front of him, staring at the numbers. His hand hovered but never dialed. Every time he looked toward the couch, where Melody sat drawing, her bunny tucked under her arm, his resolve crumbled. Finally, he set the phone down and buried his face in his hands. "What am I doing?" As if sensing his struggle, Melody padded into the kitchen. She stood quietly for a moment, then tugged at his sleeve. "David!" He lifted his head, forcing a smile. "Yeah, kiddo?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you sending me away?" David froze. He had no idea how to answer. His silence stretched too long, and he saw the fear flash in her eyes, the same fear that had followed her through every foster home, every broken promise. He shook his head quickly. "No, not if I can help it." She studied him, searching for cracks in his words. Slowly, she nodded and leaned against his arm. It was the first time she'd ever sought comfort from him physically, and it nearly undid him. Later that evening, while Melody slept, David sat at the window staring out at the snow-covered street. He thought of Anna, of how much she had wanted children, of the nights they had whispered about names and futures that never came to be. He whispered into the silence, "I think I finally understand what you meant, Anna. Maybe this is what I'm supposed to do." The decision wasn't simple, and the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But as David glanced back at Melody curled up with her bunny, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't let her disappear into the system again. She deserved more. She deserved family. Weeks passed, and David knew the moment he'd been avoiding had finally arrived. A knock came at his apartment door one cold January morning. Melody clutched her bunny tightly as David opened it to find a social worker, Ms. Reynolds, standing there with a file in hand. Her eyes softened when she saw Melody. "Hello, sweetheart," she said warmly before looking at David. "We need to talk." They sat at the kitchen table, while Melody colored in the living room, pretending not to listen. Ms. Reynolds explained the situation, Melody's runaway status, the dangers of informal care, and the need for proper guardianship. "Mr. Miller," she said firmly, "you have two options. She can return to foster care, or you can begin the process of becoming her guardian. But you'll need to prove you're capable, financially, emotionally, legally." David's chest tightened. He wasn't prepared for courts, background checks, or bureaucracy. But when he glanced at Melody's small frame hunched over her coloring book, her bunny squeezed to her chest, the choice was clear. "I'll do it," he said, voice steady. "I'll fight for her." From that moment, life became a whirlwind. Parenting classes, therapy sessions, interviews, and endless paperwork filled David's days. Melody struggled too. Nightmares came back, and sometimes she hoarded food under her bed, fearing it would all vanish again. But every time she faltered, David was there. He sat beside her through tears, read stories late into the night, and reminded her, again and again, "You're not going anywhere. Not this time." And slowly, Melody began to believe him. Months later, the adoption hearing finally arrived. The courthouse loomed tall and intimidating, its marble floors echoing every step. David held Melody's hand tightly as they walked in, his heart pounding like a drum. Inside the courtroom, the judge looked down at them from the bench. "Mr. Miller," he said, "why do you wish to adopt this child?" David swallowed hard. He looked at Melody, her small fingers wrapped around his, her eyes nervous but hopeful. He took a deep breath. "Because she's not just a child I found on a cold night," he said, his voice trembling. "She's my daughter in every way that matters. She deserves a home, stability, and love. And I want to be the one to give her that for the rest of my life." Silence filled the room. The judge studied him, then glanced at Melody. "And how do you feel, young lady?" Melody hesitated, then stood a little straighter. "I want him to be my dad," she whispered. "He makes me feel safe." David's throat tightened, tears threatening to spill. The judge smiled softly. "Then it's decided. The adoption is approved." At that moment, Melody leaped into David's arms, her bunny pressed between them. For the first time in years, David felt whole. He whispered into her hair, "You're home now. Forever." Walking out of the courthouse, the world felt different, lighter, brighter, even though snow still fell. The two of them stepped into the cold, hand in hand, no longer broken individuals, but a family. Christmas had brought David the most unexpected gift, not just a child to care for, but a second chance at life. And for Melody, it was the gift she had always longed for, a father, a home, and love that would never leave.